They said the screams were carried by the wind, but no one ever admitted to hearing them. In the spring of 1834, a door was pried open on the Sullivan property in Virginia, and what lay beneath that farmhouse was something so foul, so unnatural, that 3 lawmen who entered refused to ever speak of it again. 47 children, shackled in the dark. They bore different faces, spoke different tongues, and yet every trembling lip whispered one name: Mother Sullivan. But before we descend fully into this nightmare, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Write it in the comments, because I want to know exactly where in the world you're standing when you hear this story. Because once you know it, you won't be the same man you were before. Picture the land in 1834. Virginia, caught between 2 worlds. The old plantations still dripping with the wealth of tobacco, and the whispers of industry crawling in from the north. And in the small community of Millbrook, life seemed slow, ordinary, untouched by great events. A few dozen families, a one-room schoolhouse, a general store. Neighbors traded crops, smoked meat in red barns, sang hymns on Sundays. On the surface, it was a picture of American innocence. But the Sullivan farm was different. Not in appearance, no. It was almost too ordinary, as if built to blend in. A white clapboard farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a red barn behind it, chickens scratching at the earth. To a passing traveller, it was no more remarkable than any other stretch of farmland. But the real structure, the real purpose of that property, lay beneath. Ezra Sullivan, the patriarch, had poured money and effort into the basement. Not the modest root cellars most families used to store grain or potatoes, but something sprawling, something engineered. Piece by piece, section by section, he hired men to dig, to wall, to seal. None ever saw the whole. None were allowed. And Ezra always paid in full, in cash, as if secrecy itself was part of the contract. Then there was Constance. Constant, as some records named her. To neighbours, she was the perfect minister's wife figure. Dark-haired, soft-voiced, neatly dressed, she spoke of charity, of taking in poor orphans, children she explained that her relatives could not care for. Only until they find homes, she'd say, smiling gently. And no one questioned her, because death was common, parents often gone too soon, and orphans were everywhere in that century. But here's the question that gnaws at the edges of history. How did no one ask more? How did an entire community see wagon loads of children, yet accept the silence in their eyes? How did no one notice that these orphans never left? The general storekeeper, Thomas Henderson, remembered it later. How Constant bought food in bulk, far more than a childless couple should need. How she stocked up on medicines for ailments no one ever saw. How she always had just enough of an explanation to ease suspicion. And still, at night, neighbours whispered of odd sounds, hammering in the dark, lights burning past midnight, voices that carried but never resolved into words. This wasn't just a family hiding something. This was an entire community lulled, softened, conditioned not to see. And that, my friend, is the first lesson in this descent. True evil does not hide in shadows. It hides in plain sight, wearing the mask of normalcy until the day the mask slips and you see the monster that's been smiling at you all along. When the sheriff's men broke open the basement door, the smell hit first. It was not the smell of death, at least not fresh, but of damp stone, rust, and something fouler. The odour of unwashed bodies trapped for years without air or light. The lanterns flickered as the men descended the narrow stairway, and the first beam of light swept across a wall lined with chains. Iron cuffs bolted into stone, and dangling from them, children. Some were awake, some barely conscious, some too weak to move. Their wrists were rubbed raw, their ankles swollen from rusted restraints. They were dressed in rags that might once have been shirts, but now clung to them like strips of skin, and as the deputies stumbled forward horrified, one child raised a trembling hand and whispered it. Mother Sullivan. Then another, and another, until 47 voices, cracked and broken, hissed the same cursed name in the dark. Think about that for a moment. 47 children, different races, different tongues, none related, yet all bound by a single fear, a single worship, a single word. How does such a thing happen? How does a woman, presented to her neighbours as a benevolent caretaker, twist herself into something so monstrous? The answer is control, and not just the kind enforced by chains and whips, but something deeper, psychological captivity. Reports say some of the children didn't flinch when touched, didn't cry when freed, didn't even attempt to run when their chains were unlocked. It was as if their spirits had been drained long before their bodies were, as if they had been broken, not just enslaved, and yet they clung to her name, whispered it like prayer, even in her absence. That is not just abuse, it is indoctrination. It is what happens when a human being is taught that their tormentor is their only source of survival. The investigators tried to piece together how long this had gone on. Some children could barely remember the world outside. Others spoke in languages the officers did not even understand. Historians later noted that the Sullivan farm sat not far from the James River, a river that connected Virginia to the ports of the Atlantic. Children could have been taken from anywhere. Orphans, immigrants, the lost and forgotten of early America, plucked out of obscurity and fed into a basement designed not for storage, but for breaking souls. And here's the part that should make you uneasy. The official reports did not last. Buried in county archives, scattered across whispers and secondary accounts. 3 deputies resigned after that night, refusing to speak of what they saw. The local sheriff's notes vanished before the decade was out. Newspapers never ran the story. The community turned inward, silent. It was as if the land itself had swallowed the truth. But evil never disappears. It mutates. It buries itself until another century, another generation, when the same methods are used again, sometimes in different forms, sometimes under different names. Ask yourself, if this could happen in a quiet Virginia town, hidden in plain sight for decades, what else could be happening in your world right now, just beyond your fence line, just beneath your feet? For 2 decades, the Sullivans dined with their neighbours, prayed in the same pews, traded goods at the same general store, all while keeping 47 children chained beneath their farmhouse. How? How could something so vast, so monstrous, remain invisible to those living only a stone's throw away? The answer lies in the oldest trick of power: appearances. Ezra and Constance Sullivan crafted the perfect mask. He, the stoic landowner with quiet authority. She, the charitable woman with soft eyes and a tender voice. She wove a tale of orphans, children from distant relatives in Pennsylvania, children who needed temporary shelter, children too traumatized to be seen in public. And the community accepted it, not because they believed her fully, but because it was easier to believe than to question. Think about it. Every so often a neighbour might catch the glimpse of a child's pale face in the wagon, silent, wide-eyed, peering through the slats. When asked, Constance would smile gently and say, "They are shy, they have suffered greatly." Who could argue with such words? Who would dare accuse a woman who spoke of Christian charity, who handed coins to the church plate, who looked the part of virtue itself? This is how manipulation works. Not by force alone, but by weaving a story so comfortable, so socially acceptable, that no one dares to pull at the threads. The Sullivans understood the psychology of their time. Communities in 1834 were tight-knit, yes, but they were also fragile. To accuse a neighbour of evil was to risk dividing the entire town, and so silence became the greater virtue. Suspicion was swallowed, and while Millbrook prayed on Sundays, the sound of hammering carried across the fields at night. But secrecy is never built by lies alone. It requires participation, unwilling, unconscious participation. Every man who sold the Sullivans wood for their basement, expansion. Every labourer who dug in the soil without asking why. Every merchant who sold them medicines in quantities no one family should need. Each became a cog in the machinery of silence, not out of malice but out of habit, out of trust, out of the simple human urge not to see what might shatter the illusion of safety. That is the most disturbing truth here. The Sullivans didn't operate in the shadows. They operated in the open. protected by the blindness of ordinary people. And that blindness wasn't unique to Millbrook, it exists everywhere, even now. Communities convince themselves not to look too closely, to accept the explanation given, to avoid the pain of knowing. Ask yourself, how many masks surround you? How many faces in your own life wear the perfect smile while behind closed doors something unspeakable festers? And here's the darker question. What role do you play in keeping their secret alive, simply by not asking, simply by letting it slide? The Sullivans built a basement of chains, but the community built the silence that made it possible. And history shows us, again and again, that silence is the soil where monsters grow. Chains can bind a body, but only fear and faith can bind a soul. That was Mother Sullivan's true genius, her true horror. She did not simply keep children in darkness, she reshaped their minds so that even when the chains were removed, their spirits remained shackled. The proof is in their whispers. 47 children, broken, bruised, half-starved, and yet all of them spoke her name with reverence. Not monster, not captor, not witch. They said mother. This is the pattern of every system of domination in history. Brutality alone is never enough. It breeds rebellion. But brutality wrapped in ritual, brutality disguised as care, that breeds worship. Mother Sullivan understood this. She fed them just enough to keep them alive, but every scrap of bread came with a lesson. You breathe because of me, you eat because of me, you live because of me. And so hunger became not just physical pain but spiritual training. Survivor accounts are scarce, but fragments remain. One deputy wrote in his diary that some of the children refused food from the rescuers, crying for Sullivan instead. Think about the depth of that programming. To starve for years and yet reject salvation because it didn't come from the hand of the tormentor. That's not natural, that's engineered. It mirrors something far larger than the Sullivan basement. It mirrors kingdoms, churches, and empires. Systems that break people down, then offer comfort only through the very hand that holds the whip. This is how institutions across history have ruled, not by force alone, but by convincing the victim that the captor is also the savior. And here is where the descent grows darker. Mother Sullivan introduced ritual. Neighbours spoke of hymn singing drifting faintly across the fields at odd hours. Investigators found markings on the basement walls, crude carvings, symbols resembling crosses, circles, and tally meads, marks etched by tiny hands. These were not decorations, they were the remnants of children forced to participate in her twisted liturgy, singing songs to their jailer, scratching prayers into stone, transforming captivity into devotion. This is what breaks a man more deeply than chains, when he begins to confuse his suffering with his salvation, when the hand that feeds him also bleeds him and he no longer knows the difference. This is how cults are born. This is how entire nations are ruled. Now I need to speak directly to you. If you're still here, listening, understand this. You are not just hearing about a farmhouse in Virginia. You are staring into the reflection of something much larger, because every system of control, from the smallest cult to the largest empire, uses the same formula: isolation, dependence, ritual, reward, fear. And I want you to lock this lesson into your identity so it never leaves you. Go into the comments right now and write the phrase: "The chains are everywhere, the mask is thin." Write it twice, not once, twice. That is how you mark yourself as someone who sees, someone who will never again bow to the smiling face of the captor. Here's the question that has haunted every historian who dares to brush the dust off the Sullivan files. Was this one woman's madness, or was it a doorway into something larger? Because what we find in Virginia in 1834 does not feel isolated. 47 children from different bloodlines, different languages, all funneled into one farmhouse basement. That does not happen by chance. That suggests supply. That suggests network. That suggests an order moving silently beneath the surface of early America. Look at the geography. The Sullivan farm sat less than a day's ride from the James River, a major artery flowing straight into the Atlantic. Ports along that river dealt in tobacco, cotton, and human flesh. Remember, this was a time when trafficking was not some hidden scandal. It was the foundation of the economy. Children, especially those without families, could vanish into that current without leaving a ripple. Orphans from Pennsylvania, immigrant children fresh from the docks, slaves' children separated from their parents. The forgotten, the unwanted, the weak. Easy prey for hands that knew where to reach. Do you think a single couple on a quiet farm orchestrated that alone? Or does it sound more like they were one branch of a deeper tree? Ask yourself, why did the sheriff's notes vanish? Why did newspapers never run the story? Why were deputies silenced? Why did 3 resign rather than speak? Was it shame or was it pressure? Perhaps someone higher, someone more powerful, decided this secret was never meant to surface. The Sullivan basement feels less like a random crime and more like an experiment, a test bed. 47 children conditioned through isolation, hunger and ritual into something unrecognizable. Do you not see the pattern? Institutions have always experimented on the forgotten, whether in asylums, workhouses, plantations or prisons. The poor, the orphaned, the enslaved, those deemed disposable by society, have always been the clay on which the ruling hand shapes its hidden projects. And here is the part no one wants to hear. These projects do not end, they evolve. From basements to laboratories, from backwoods farms to government facilities, from hymn singing to psychological programming. The stage changes, the names change, the masks change, but the method is constant. Control, break the body, break the will, rebuild devotion. So when you hear the name Mother Sullivan, you should not think of one farm wife gone mad. You should think of every faceless hand throughout history that has smiled while binding chains. You should think of every system that punished the weak under the banner of salvation. Because this was not just Millbrook's nightmare, it was America's omen. And here's what chills me most. There are whispers, buried deep in letters and testimonies, that Constance Sullivan was seen traveling often, not just to Richmond, but to Washington, the capital of the young republic. Why? For what purpose? And with whom did she meet? Washington, 1830s. A city still young, still unfinished, its marble buildings rising like monuments to freedom, while shadows pooled beneath their steps. And into those halls, into those gatherings of men shaping the nation, whispers say Constance Sullivan sometimes appeared. Not as a beggar, not as an outcast, but as a woman of refinement, speaking softly, dressed modestly, carrying herself as one of them. Why would a farmer's wife from Henrico County need to travel so often to the capital? And why did her trips always coincide with sudden surpluses of new children appearing on her land? These questions scrape at the edges of something no one dares to admit. The possibility that the Sullivan basement was not a rogue horror, but a carefully tolerated one. A chamber of experimentation hidden in plain sight, feeding knowledge upward into those who understood its value. Consider this. In 1833, a year before the raid, the US Congress debated child labor laws. Do you think it is coincidence that around the same time, a farmhouse basement in Virginia was filled with 47 children being broken and conditioned like clay? Do you think it is accident that the very techniques found in the Sullivan cellar, ritual, starvation, isolation, would later echo in institutional schools, orphanages, and even military training systems? No, my friend, the pattern is clear. The Sullivan farm was not the disease, it was the symptom. A test site for methods that would later be scaled, refined, legitimized under the banners of law, education, reform. The mask always changes, but the essence is the same. Break the individual, strip away his will, rebuild him into what the system requires. And here is where the truth becomes almost unbearable. If Constance Sullivan met with men of influence in Washington, then the silence that followed the raid makes sense. The missing sheriff's the absence of news reports, the sudden resignations. This was not just community denial, it was intervention. Someone higher up made sure the truth never spread, because if it did, the mask would have cracked. The illusion of virtue, of progress, of a young America rising in freedom would have been stained with the blood of 47 chained children. But history tells us this: when something is buried so completely, so aggressively, it is not because it is meaningless. It is because it is precious, because it is useful, because it is meant to be hidden until the time comes to use it again. So I ask you, if the Sullivan experiment ended in 1834, where did the knowledge go? Who inherited it? What institutions rose in its wake, built on techniques of psychological mastery first tested in a farmhouse basement? Look around you. Look at the systems that shape men today, schools that break children's wills, corporations that strip identity, governments that trade fear for loyalty. Do you really think this began with them? Or do you see now that the roots stretch back further, back into the damp soil of Virginia, back into the hands of Mother Sullivan? After the basement was exposed, the easy story would have been that the nightmare ended there, that the children were freed, the Sullivans punished, and Virginia moved on. But the silence that followed tells us the opposite. This was not an ending, it was a transfer. What began in one farmhouse basement seeped outward, absorbed into larger systems, repackaged under noble names. And this is where the story turns from horror to revelation, because what happened to those 47 children is the blueprint for what has happened to millions since. Think about the orphan trains of the mid-1800s, children gathered by the thousands, loaded onto rail cars, shipped across America like cattle, sold as labor, stripped of names, given to families who needed workers more than sons or daughters. Does that sound like rescue, or does it sound like replication? Does it sound like Mother Sullivan's methods scaled for an entire nation? Think about the Native American boarding schools of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Children taken from their parents, stripped of their language, punished for speaking their own names, taught to worship their captors, rebuilt in the image of the system, chains replaced by uniforms, whips replaced by rulers, but the programming, the breaking and remaking remains the same. This is how institutions grow. They take what worked in secret and rebrand it as progress. Mother Sullivan broke children until they called her mother. A century later, entire schools broke children until they called their captors teacher. And today, systems still exist that break men until they call their captors boss, leader, government, church, or nation. Different masks, same chains. But here is the darkest revelation. The Sullivan basement proves it does not take armies. It does not take armies or guards or barbed wire to enslave the human spirit. It only teaches aches, ritual, deprivation, and the illusion of care. Those children worshipped the hand that starved them. They clung to the voice that broke them. And once a system learns how to induce that loyalty, it becomes unstoppable. So what do you think happened after 1834? Do you really believe the techniques discovered in that basement were discarded? No, they were harvested, whispered about, studied, replicated in schools, asylums, prisons, and barracks, quietly perfected until entire populations could be managed the way Mother Sullivan managed her flock of chained children. And the proof is everywhere around you. Look at how you were taught as a boy, what you were rewarded for, what you were punished for, how your will was bent to fit the shape of the system. Look at how you are managed now, at work, in society, under laws written by hands you will never shake. The chains remain, but they are invisible now. This is the true inheritance of the Sullivan family. Not the farmhouse, not the land, not the basement full of chains, but the blueprint of psychological captivity. Passed on, refined, hidden in plain sight. Do you truly believe that a farmer's wife in 1834 invented these methods on her own? Do you think Constance Sullivan simply woke up one morning and decided to chain children, starve them, condition them into worship? No. What she practiced was older than America itself. She was not the beginning, she was the vessel. A woman carrying a darker inheritance passed down through whispers, rituals, and traditions that travelled across oceans long before the new republic was born. Look at the techniques she used: isolation, hunger, ritual chants, forced devotion. These are not new inventions. They are the same methods used in the catacombs of Rome when Christians were broken. The same methods practiced by cults that demanded children as offerings. The same methods whispered in medieval dungeons where prisoners confessed to crimes they never committed. Always the same formula: strip the soul, break the will, remake the mind. Where did she learn it? Consider this. Constance arrived in Virginia from Pennsylvania in 1811, a region already thick with secret societies, esoteric sects, and imported European orders. The 18th and early 19th centuries were alive with shadow fraternities, lodges meeting in candlelit rooms, men whispering oaths by torchlight, women teaching domestic arts that were far more than recipes and needlework. Who initiated her? Who placed the seed in her ear that the mind of a child was the purest clay for moulding obedience? And do not dismiss the symbolism. 47 children. Why not 50? Why not 40? Why did the number fall there? In many ancient systems, numbers are never accidents. They are marks of ritual, of cycles, of hidden calculations. What if those chains were not simply tools of restraint, but symbols in a larger ritual? A ritual designed not just to control children, but to feed something unseen. The investigators found carvings on the wall. Circles, crosses, marks scratched by small hands. But what if those carvings were not spontaneous? What if they were dictated? Imagine a woman standing before a row of chained children, commanding them to inscribe prayers into stone. Imagine how repetition, song, hunger, and pain could twist their minds into a collective ritual. Was this merely cruelty, or was it devotion to something far older, something that demanded sacrifice, not of blood, but of innocence itself? The Sullivan basement becomes less a crime scene and more a temple hidden under clapboard siding and farmland, a temple where broken children became offerings, where chains were sacraments, where worship was torn from the mouths of the weak. And this temple did not rise in isolation. It echoed with knowledge carried across seas, knowledge whispered in Europe's darker corners, knowledge that finds its way, always, into the hands of those willing to use it. Ask yourself, how many such basements existed? How many still exist? If one farmhouse in Virginia could hide 47 souls in bondage, how many more cellars, barns, institutions, and chambers across the young nation were used for the same? This is not just history, it is continuity. A dark thread winding through centuries, sowing cruelty into power, passing the same tools from hand to hand, masked as charity, cloaked as faith, justified as order. By the time the Sullivan farmhouse was raided in 1834, the blueprint was already complete. The experiment had been proven. A human being could be broken, not only in body, but in spirit, reshaped until loyalty was no longer a choice, but a reflex. And history shows us exactly what happens when knowledge like that falls into the hands of states and institutions hungry for control. Fast forward less than a century, and you see it everywhere. In schools designed not to educate, but to condition, children lined in rows, bells dictating their movements, voices silenced unless permission is given, rewards for compliance, punishment for resistance. Does it look different from chains and darkness? Yes, but the principle is the same. Strip individuality, replace it with obedience. A classroom is only a polished version of the Sullivan basement. Then consider the rise of asylums and prisons, built not to heal, not to redeem, but to confine and reshape behavior. Isolation, repetition, punishment, reward. Sullivan's tools, renamed as medicine, science, progress, and behind them, whispers of research, hidden programs, state experiments in conditioning, behavior modification, psychological warfare. Always the same core: control the will, bend the soul. And when the world plunged into the wars of the 20th century, those blueprints became weapons. Armies no longer relied only on bullets and bayonets, they relied on breaking men from the inside. Training camps that strip boys of identity, rebuild them as soldiers who obey without hesitation. Propaganda that keeps entire populations in chains of belief. Fear as a leash, ritual as a binding cord. Sullivan's basement, scaled to nations. Do you think it is coincidence that the same techniques appear in every system of mass control? That cults, armies, corporations, and governments all rely on the same cycle: deprivation, ritual, rewards. RD, fear. Do you think that pattern emerged by accident, or does it look more like a lineage of knowledge passed hand to hand, tested in basements and institutions until perfected? And here is the most unsettling thought. When the sheriff's notes vanished, when the newspapers fell silent, when deputies resigned and refused to speak, it was not the end of the story. It was the preservation of it. The Sullivan case was absorbed, hidden, protected. Why? Because the methods were too valuable to lose. Today, you live in a world where those methods are no longer confined to dungeons. They live in your screens, your schedules, your laws, your culture, chains you cannot touch but can feel, chains that keep you from breaking rank, from questioning too loudly, from stepping outside the rhythm designed for you. And just like those children in the basement, many of us whisper the names of our captors with reverence, mistaking servitude for safety. This is the final descent, to see that the Sullivan story was never about Virginia, never about 1834, never about one family. It was a seed, and you are living in the forest it grew into. You have walked with me through the farmhouse, through the basement, through the silence that swallowed 47 children. You have seen how one family's secret became a blueprint, how that blueprint seeped into institutions, how it reshaped nations. And now we stand at the final descent, the most dangerous part. Because knowledge without action is another chain. And the question that remains is simple. If the chains are everywhere, how does a man break them? The first step is vision, to see the mask for what it is, to look at the smiling face of authority, be it teacher, priest, boss, or politician, and know the difference between guidance and control, to hear the words of safety and charity and ask, who benefits when I obey, who grows stronger when I remain silent? Remember Millbrook, the town that saw wagon loads of children but chose to look away. They did not want to see, and that blindness was the soil where monsters thrived. You must never blind yourself again. The second step is resistance, not the kind written in songs or shouted in the streets, but the quiet, ruthless refusal to let your soul bend. The Sullivan children broke because they were isolated, dependent, stripped of choice. But you, listening now, you are not isolated, not yet. You have a voice, a will, a fire still burning inside. To resist is to guard that fire with everything you have, to never let ritual or fear or comfort extinguish it. The third step is transformation. Every man who sees through the mask is no longer the same. He cannot return to ignorance, cannot take comfort in the lullabies of the system. Once the chains are visible, they burn against your skin until you rip them free. But freedom comes with a cost. The cost is loneliness. The cost is exile from the herd. The cost is carrying truths others will not dare to touch. Are you ready to pay that cost? Because that is what separates you, as the broken from the free. Look at the world around you. How many are still chained, whispering the names of their captors with love? How many men work themselves into graves for masters they will never meet? How many children are being broken right now in schools, in homes, in invisible basements of the mind? The chains remain, but they have become invisible, and that makes them stronger. But not for you, not anymore, because you know. You have descended into the basement with me, you have heard the whispers, you have seen the pattern, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. That is your awakening, that is your inheritance, that is your responsibility. So listen carefully to my final words. Do not worship your captors, do not trust the mask, do not ignore the faint cries carried on the wind, because what was done in 1834 still lives today, only dressed in finer clothes. The Sullivan basement is not history, it is a mirror, and the man who dares to see his reflection clearly is no longer a prisoner. He is dangerous, he is free. Now tell me in the comments one last time. The chains are everywhere, the mask is thin. Write it twice, burn it into the page, burn it into your mind, burn it into your identity, because once those words leave your hand, you are no longer just a listener. You are a man reborn, aware, awakened, untouchable. And remember this, they wanted this story buried, they wanted you blind, but you are here, you have heard it. And once a man has seen the basement, he can never kneel to the mask again.